Tehran and Washington are talking tough, yet in some ways are signaling a desire for talks. President Donald Trump has threatened Iran in the wake of recent military action in Yemen. Iran has warned that any attack on the country will be met with a devastating response. This coming after Trump sent a letter to Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei with an offer for negotiations, or else all options are on the table. So is this a carrot and a stick diplomacy used by Trump to bring Tehran to the table for talks, or is the US going to war? With us to discuss is Mark Dubowitz, the chief executive of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies based in Washington, D.C. He's an expert on Iran's nuclear program and is a key influencer in shaping policies to counter threats from the Islamic Republic.
I think the Supreme Leader faces probably the most fateful decision of his 35 years as Supreme Leader. And that is he going to do a peaceful nuclear deal, or is he going to have the United States and Israel take down his program and potentially take down his regime?
I'm Negar Moshahedi, and this is Eye for Iran. Mark Dubowitz of the FDD and the host of a new podcast, The Iran Breakdown, which you can find on any podcast platform. Congratulations, it's an amazing podcast, is joining us now. Thank you for being here, Mark.
Thanks so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
Mark, the question on so many minds right now, is the United States laying the groundwork to go to war with Iran?
I think the United States is laying the groundwork for potentially a number of different options. I think the president's preference is a peaceful, negotiated deal with the regime over their nuclear program. And I think he signaled time and time again that's what he prefers. He'd like to do a deal that dismantles Iran's nuclear weapons program. And it's very important, when we can talk a lot about that in detail, a deal that permanently cuts off all pathways to nuclear weapons, right? Not the 2015 deal of Obama, but a permanent deal. That's what he wants. He understands to get there, he's going to have to build leverage. So he has reimposed the maximum pressure campaign of economic sanctions that he imposed first term of his administration. And he's certainly signaling that if the Supreme Leader of Iran is not interested in peacefully dismantling the program, then it will be militarily dismantled, either by the United States or by Israel or by both.
What about the long term? Can you have a peaceful dismantling of Iran's nuclear program if, with the existence of the Islamic Republic itself and the establishment, is that even possible in the long run?
I think that's exactly right. I think the one element of U.S. strategy that is missing, unfortunately, is not just maximum pressure on the regime, but maximum support for the Iranian people. I think you know me, FDD. We've been longtime advocates of this. It is absolutely essential that we support the millions of Iranians who despise this regime and want to see the end of the Islamic Republic. That is the only long-term solution to this problem. Otherwise, these short-term nuclear deals are with this regime, they're going to be violated. The regime will wait until there's a new president, if somebody else in the White House is not willing to use force, and then they'll pocket the hundreds of billions of dollars in sanctions relief, which they will use not for the Iranian people, but for the continued regime corruption. And then at a time of the choosing, they will break out or sneak out to a nuclear weapon. So absolutely, the long-term solution to this is supporting the people to bring down the Islamic Republic and replacing it with a free Iran.
And how can you provide maximum support for the people of Iran? Can you give me some tangible examples of what the U.S. could do? Could they provide a strike fund, for instance? What steps could they take?
Right. So, a labor strike fund. I'll just step back for a sec before we get into specific ideas. But the United States has done this very successfully during the Cold War. So Ronald Reagan came into office and he decided to abandon the U.S. strategy of détente with the Soviet Union. And he understood that he could use maximum pressure against the Soviet Union and provide maximum support to anti-Soviet dissidents behind the Iron Curtain. And in fact, he instructed his CIA director at the time, Bill Casey, to run a maximum support program for these anti-Soviet dissidents. So these are things that have actually been tried before. So for example, a labor strike fund, they were working with Lech Walesa and the Polish Solidarity movement, right, in communist Poland. And they were providing support for labor strikes. And this was something that was really helpful in putting immense pressure on the Polish Communist Party and ultimately on Soviet leaders. So a labor strike fund in Iran could be something where The United States and other allies provide money to Iranians. And as you know, and your listeners know, there's no independent trade unions in Iran. If you go on strike, you're not only risking your life, but you're not going to get a wage, and no one's going to be paying and supporting your family. So why don't we create a labor strike fund that provides support for that? A second idea is every time there are protests of any significant size, the regime shuts down the internet. And then there's a blackout, and then Iranians can't communicate. If you can't communicate, you can't mobilize. If you can't mobilize, you can't effectively protest. There are ways that we can provide workarounds, Starlink terminals, other communication devices, ways to ensure that communication stays live during these protests. So, that's the second idea. The third idea is when these protests occur, there are ways through cyber and other means that we could blind the security services. So when the security services are fanning out to go and crush these protests and brutalize Iranians, there are ways that we could blind these security services so that they wouldn't be as effective. And that could be done through a variety of means. So, there are a whole host of ideas. We've put out memos on this. And we put this with one of our partners, the National Union for Free Democratic Iran, Nufti. Some of your listeners may know Nufti. So there's on our website, on Nufti's website, there are maximum support ideas. And there are many more other ideas that we certainly wouldn't put on our website and we wouldn't discuss publicly because we know that the regime is listening to your podcast. But there's a lot that can be done. There's a lot that has been done. But the one thing that is clear is we're missing a massive opportunity that is in U.S. interests to support the Iranian people on the streets. And rather than having them take to the streets and getting no support, either rhetorical support or more importantly, material support, we have been letting them go by themselves against the brutality of the security services and have time and time again missed the opportunity.
And what has the response been like so far in terms of the Trump administration with what you've been proposing here?
The problem in Washington is that when you start to talk about support for the people and undermining the regime and weakening the regime and replacing the regime with a free Iran, people hear in their minds, they hear regime change. And when they hear regime change, their brains freeze. And all they can think of is Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya. All they can think of is military-led regime change, right? And no one, certainly we're not, talking about 500,000 mechanized U.S. troops invading Iran and getting rid of the regime. We're talking about what Reagan did, the Reagan strategy of maximum support. So we have to get over this kind of psychological hurdle that this is not Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya regime change. This is supporting people like we did during the Cold War, Iranians who will take down the regime themselves. And we've already seen Iranians on the streets, millions of Iranians since 2009 in successive protests, 2009 Green Revolution, 2017, 18, 19 economic protests that transformed into political protests. And then, of course, Women Life Freedom, where, you've got Iranian women and men on the streets protesting against this gender apartheid of the regime. And in every single case, we're not there to support them. FDD has an Iran protest tracker. I don't know if you've seen it.
Yes.
We track the protests every week. There are protests, dozens of protests every week. It's still happening. And it's only a matter of time before there are mass protests again. And shame on us if we're not ready to support the Iranian people the next time they're on the streets.
Let's go back to the answer to your first question, that you said that Trump prefers diplomacy and that he's laying the groundwork for all options. All options are on the table here, as you pointed out. Now, we've already heard from IRGC Commander Major General Hossein Salami, who responded that any act of aggression against the country would be met with devastating response. Now, first of all, does his rhetoric represent that officially of the Iranian state itself? And if it does, does that mean that the United States will potentially then go to war with Iran?
Well, I think, listen, first of all, these bellicose statements by Salami and other IRGC leaders, we're used to it. We're used to it from Khamenei himself. There's a lot of rhetoric, overblown rhetoric, because I don't think their capabilities match their threats. If you would need any other indication of that, look at the past year of what Israel has actually done to the regime. Right? In April, but most particularly in October of last year, Israeli air jets flew in. They destroyed the Islamic Republic strategic air defenses that were provided by Russia. They took down 93% of the regime's ballistic missile production capabilities. And they actually hit a nuclear warhead design facility at Parchin. And they did this without losing one pilot, without any costs. They've also done devastating damage to the regime's most powerful and important proxy, Hezbollah, in Lebanon. They killed the head of Hezbollah, Nasrallah. They took out Radwan leadership. They took out the majority of the missiles and rockets and precision-guided munitions. Hezbollah today is not down. They're not out, but they're down. And they've done severe damage to another regime proxy, Hamas and Islamic Jihad. So I think the regime talks a big game, but at the end of the day, they have shown far less impressive capabilities. And remember, they fired over 400 ballistic missiles and cruise missiles at Israel in April and in October. And in every case, except I think a couple of them got through, Israel, in coordination with the United States and with other allies in the region, were able to shoot down or block all of those missiles. So capabilities, certainly the intention is there. The regime clearly wants to destroy Israel and clearly wants to do severe damage to the United States of America. So intentions are there, but capabilities have been less than impressive.
Yeah, that leads me to my next question. If there is a war, how would Iran even respond? What would that war look like?
Well, that's the question. I mean, the conventional wisdom used to be they would respond through the use of Hezbollah, and Hezbollah always sort of sat on the neck of the Israelis as they thought about the devastating damage that Hezbollah could do to Israeli cities and Israeli civilians. That damage, again, it's not gone. That risk is not gone, but it's been severely limited and mitigated. The missile production capabilities, they're still there. They still got a large inventory. But again, that has been less than successful. I would think that the way that the regime is thinking of responding is twofold. One is overseas terrorist operations using Hezbollah and regime proxies and regime agents in the United States, through Latin America, through Europe, and maybe Asia, going after U.S. targets, Israeli targets, Jewish civilian targets. And a second way would be to rush to the nuclear weapon and break out or sneak out to a bomb. Those seems to be the two paths that are left. I mean, they've still got the Houthis. I mean, the Houthis are obviously creating huge problems in the Red Sea. The Trump administration is currently, as we speak, pounding Houthi positions and going after Houthi capabilities. So that proxy still exists. Shiite militias are still there in Iraq, but they've been cautious. They certainly did not get involved in Syria when Assad was going down. They've been very reticent about taking on the Israelis. And so I think when Khamenei looks at his options, his proxy network is certainly not as formidable as it used to be. But he has these terror agents, these sleeper cells around the world that he can ignite. And of course, he's got his nuclear weapons program, and that he can make the final dash to the bomb.
You mentioned the Houthis. Now, Trump says that he will hold Iran responsible for any further attacks by the Houthis, and they're not backing down. We had attacks as recent as last night. Iran, for its part, is trying to distance itself from them. How would you, before we talk about that and get into that discussion, how would you characterize the relationship between Iran and the Houthis? Do they control everything that the Houthis do?
Yeah, I mean, there's always been this sort of debate in military and academic circles about do they control these proxies? Are they actually proxies? I think that debate is less important than the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the militias in Iraq would not be formidable, dangerous fighting forces without support from the Islamic Republic of Iran, right? Financial support, military support, training, and intelligence support. They would be problematic, irritating, but they wouldn't be dangerous and lethal terror armies. So the regime has turned these terrorist organizations into terror armies, and I think the Houthis have their own, political, own separate nationalist political agenda within Yemen. They're not going to take kind of direct orders from the IRGC or from Khamenei himself, but neither would Hezbollah, neither would Hamas, neither would Islamic Jihad. I mean, they had their own priorities, but the Houthis would not be like these other terrorist groups able to attack U.S. Navy warships and international shipping with the kind of impunity that they have and the kind of lethality that they have without support from the Islamic Republic.
And the Houthis, as we said, are not backing down. So what does this mean for Iran and the Trump administration when he says he'll hold Iran responsible?
Well, he needs to hold the regime responsible. I mean, it's enough playing whack-a-mole with the Houthis. The Houthis they're happy to keep fighting with America and Israel. This is great for them. They love it. Death to America, death to Israel, death to the Jews. That's their motto. So this notion that we're going to spend, $1.5 billion knocking down Houthi drones or missiles that probably cost a few $1 million, the economics make no sense, and we're not going to create deterrence by only denial. We're going to create deterrence by punishment. And the only way we create deterrence by punishment is we got to target the IRGC ports, spy ships, and command and control structure that supports the Houthis. We've got to inflict massive pain on the Islamic Republic of Iran in order to change their calculus with respect to support for the Houthis. And again, the Houthis may not listen to the regime, but at this point, the Houthis would not be a lethal fighting force if they were not having their weapons replenished by the regime, if they were not receiving intelligence from these spy ships, these regime spy ships that are that are providing specific targeting information, and certainly would be less capable if they were not being trained by the IRGC and Hezbollah.
And how would that response look like? Would it have to be done through military options, or could it be done through more maximum pressure?
I think it needs to be both. I think it needs to be significant maximum pressure, right? Serious economic sanctions. I mean, driving oil down, freezing those oil funds, any kind of sanction circumvention, shutting those doors down, returning to the maximum economic pressure campaign that we saw in 2018, 2019, 2020, which was quite successful in really constraining regime resources. But I think at the end of the day, where we are today is, sanctions are not a silver bullet in solving any of these problems. The supreme leader of Iran needs to understand that if he continues to do this, if he continues to fund and foment violence and aggression around the region, if he continues to move forward on his nuclear weapons program, that the United States of America and Israel are going to jointly take down his nuclear program and take down his regime. And go after leadership assets, decapitate the highest echelons of the IRGC and the Ministry of Intelligence, go after the people around the supreme leader. They need to do to the regime in Iran what they did to Hezbollah and Hamas in Lebanon and Gaza. And those were very successful decapitation campaigns that removed not only the first tier of leadership, but the second tier, the third tier, and I think those organizations are maybe down to the fourth tier.
So are we going to see that sometime in 2025, that what Israel did to Hezbollah, like you just said, like joint operation between the U.S. and Israel to Iran now?
Look, that is certainly the big question. I think Trump has, according to public reporting, he sent a letter to Khamenei. He gave the supreme leader a 2-month deadline for negotiations, and then he has threatened more severe consequences. We'll see. I know for sure the Israelis are very interested in taking advantage of the weakness of the regime today and using military force to strike at the nuclear weapons program and, if necessary, go after leadership assets. And the question will be, is the United States going to support that, and in what way? I think the United States will support it in some way. Now, whether it's a joint attack or providing the Israelis with all the capabilities they need in order to be successful, I think the Trump administration fully understands that 2025 is a critical year, and President Trump will not let the Iranian regime get nuclear weapons, certainly not on his watch. And so I think the Supreme Leader faces probably the most fateful decision of his 35 years as Supreme Leader. And that is he going to do a peaceful nuclear deal, or is he going to have the United States and Israel take down his program and potentially take down his regime?
And Axios is now reporting that there's going to be a high-level delegation from Israel and the U.S. meeting at the White House next week to talk about Iran. What are your thoughts on that, and given everything you just talked about?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, given what I've said, given the fact that the next 2 months are going to be critical, given the fact 2025 is really the year of the Islamic Republic of Iran and a fateful year, the most senior officials from Israel, from the Prime Minister's office, from Mossad, from the Foreign Ministry, from military intelligence, from all the relevant places are going to be coming to Washington. They're going to be meeting with their counterparts here in the White House and across the interagency for not only consultations, but joint planning. Obviously, that planning that I think the integration has never been better between the United States and Israel. The support that Israel is enjoying has never been stronger than it is today. And I think the Supreme Leader of Iran must understand that there is somebody in the White House who's very serious about dealing with this problem. And I hope it's done peacefully, but we can't allow this regime to develop the most deadly weapon.
Could 2025 be the year of the end of the Islamic Republic? I mean, I know we've been talking about this for many decades now, but like you mentioned, things are different this time around.
Look, I'm old enough, unfortunately, to remember the Cold War. I'm old enough to remember I was in a Soviet studies class at McGill University in Montreal in 1989, and I remember my Soviet studies professor came in one morning and she said, I'd like everybody to get up, take your textbook, come to the front of the class, and throw it in the garbage can. Now, this was like
Really?
Pre-internet, pre-smartphone. You probably don't even remember an era like that. And we said, what do you care?
Yes, I do.
Whatever. You do? Okay. Well, we paid $60 for this textbook. Why are we throwing it away? We got up, we threw it away. They weren't even like recycling containers because we didn't even have those in those days. We threw it in the garbage can. We sat down and we said, what's going on? She said, the Berlin Wall just came down. And, we had been studying in that class, in that textbook, that the Soviet Union was formidable, had a powerful economy, industrialized faster than any economy in human history, thousands of nuclear-tipped missiles aimed at our cities, the Red Army around the world, formidable. It had cutouts and front companies and political parties, and its intelligence agents, the KGB, had infiltrated the West and Western democracy. And we were going to have to live with the Soviet Union for 100, 500 years. And Berlin Wall came down 2 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed. It collapsed because Ronald Reagan understood that the regime was much weaker and economically bankrupt and ideologically bankrupt, and that the Red Army was stretched. And even though they may have thousands of nuclear-tipped missiles, that wasn't going to sustain the Soviet empire. I believe the Islamic Republic of Iran today is weaker than the Soviet Union was when Reagan came in. And let me give you one piece of evidence of that. There's many. I can talk economics, I can talk politics, I can talk geostrategy, I can talk military, but no, that's not what I want to talk about. Something that's, I think, close to your heart because you've been reporting on that. So the regime has tried to kill Masih Alinejad 3 times on American soil. Your listeners all know who Masih Alinejad is. I've always got to explain this to people who don't. And I say, Masih Alinejad is an Iranian woman, journalist. She came to the United States. She has a massive social media following. She has been very successful at talking to Iranian women. She laid the groundwork for what eventually became Women Life Freedom. She's been challenging the hijab and its centrality to the Islamic Republic and the Islamic Revolution. And the regime has tried to kill her 3 times on American soil. Now, if a regime was confident and secure and powerful and sure of itself and believed that it was going to survive the century, why would it be wasting resources and taking the risks of killing Masih Alinejad on American soil? And the answer is because the regime itself, Khamenei himself, knows how brittle and weak and threatened this regime is. And so his paranoia is intensifying. The circle around him is narrowing. He knows that the majority of his population despises the regime and wants a better life. And as a result, he sees Masih Alinejad as an existential threat to the Islamic Republic of Iran. And that's everything you need to know about your question, which is, yes, I do believe this regime is going down, but we need to actually be serious about this, and we need a policy of supporting the Iranian people to help bring it down.
And do you think you'll see that?
I think there's a chance. I mean, I'll tell you who's actually serious about this are the Israelis. I mean, the Israelis have made supporting the Iranian people a central pillar of their Iran strategy. And that's recent. That's not, long-standing. I think there's been now a recognition in Israel that they too, if they're going to deal with this enemy, that one of their best allies are Iranians, who want to see the end of this regime and want to live a better life. So I think Israeli support in various ways, don't want to discuss it on a public podcast, I think is useful. And I think if the Israelis can show success, they can show the Americans, look, supporting the Iranian people is really getting impact. And so why don't we work together, U.S., Israel, maybe we can get some of our other allies involved in this and really provide the Iranian people with what they need in order to bring down this regime.
Could Israel apply enough pressure on the United States to have influence? And can we also, in your answer, talk about Russia, add Russia into the mix, and what influence does Russia have, if any at all, on the Trump administration and on Iran?
Look, I think the United States and Israel see eye to eye on the threat from the Islamic Republic. I think they see eye to eye on the necessity of taking serious measures and significantly undermining the regime, militarily, politically, ideologically, economically. I think, as I said, on the question of maximum support, I think if the Israelis can show success in some of the things that they are doing and planning on doing, I think that can convince American policymakers. I mean, I would underscore to your listeners something that they've seen when they've seen Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu send out videos with Farsi subtitles to Iranians. Just the other day, he had another video where he posted in Farsi sort of technical details on water, right? Understanding the significant droughts that are in Iran, the massive corruption of the regime that has prevented Iranians from accessing water for agriculture and for their daily lives. And he took the step of taking Israel's expertise. Israel has enormous expertise in water, a country that has had no fresh water or very little fresh water, and learning how to recycle water, and has become a world leader in water technology, and taking some of that expertise, translating in Farsi, putting on a website and saying to Iranians, here's what you need. So he's had this campaign of videos talking to Iranians and going over the heads of the regime to talk about the really important relationship between Israelis and Iranians. And I think that's been really important messaging. I'm a firm believer that one day the Iranians and Israelis will be the best of friends in the Middle East. There'll be no better friends in the Middle East. So I think that's very important. On the Russia side, look, I think the Trump administration, since the early days of Trump won, has believed that they can flip the Russians against the Islamic Republic of Iran. They appreciate historically that there's been a lot of tension between Russia and Iran, between the Soviet Union and Iran. People forget, many people don't know, but it was the United States who kept Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union out of Iran and preserved the territorial integrity of Iran. And so there's been a lot of tension in that Russian-Iranian relationship. It's grown closer in the recent years, particularly since Russia invaded Ukraine and the Islamic Republic is providing drones and missiles to Putin to help kill Ukrainians. So there's no doubt the relationship is closer. I think the Trump administration thinks they can undermine that Russia-Iran bilateral relationship, pull in Putin, flip him against Khamenei, maybe get the Russians involved in helping resolve this nuclear weapons problem. I'm skeptical. I think it's going to be an enormous lift. I think they have to be very careful about how they work with Putin on this, because he's very likely to pocket any concessions he gets and then flip back to supporting Khamenei and the Islamic Republic. But this is certainly an effort is underway to do this.
Could Russia in any way break off or jeopardize what the United States and Israel are trying to do in Iran, potentially, given Vladimir Putin's behavior?
Oh, I think absolutely. I mean, I think it can be a massive spoiler. So yeah, while the Trump administration may be optimistic about flipping Russia against Iran, I'm pessimistic, because I think that the Russians could be a huge problem. I mean, they could be a huge problem in the nuclear negotiations like they were in 2015 when they basically negotiated on behalf of the Islamic Republic and managed to negotiate from a Khamenei's point of view, an excellent nuclear deal where they were acting as Khamenei's lawyer at the negotiating table. They could be hugely problematic in terms of arming the Islamic Republic's military and providing fighter jets and battle tanks and attack helicopters that would boost the military capabilities of the IRGC. And they could be hugely problematic what happens inside Iran. I mean, I don't think Vladimir Putin wants to see the end of the Islamic Republic. So in that respect, he is on the opposite side of the aisle from the Iranian people. He wants to preserve Khamenei. He wants to preserve the Islamic Republic. It's in his interest. It's anti-American. The last thing he needs is a pro-American Iran and a free Iran that is aligned with the United States and aligned against him.
So how do you see the potential ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia as impacting Iran?
Well, I think that's part of the calculation of the Trump administration. I think they think that if they can get a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, that will help facilitate this split that I'm talking about, this idea that now they'll be able to flip Putin against Khamenei, and that Russia will now no longer need the Islamic Republic in the same way that it did before, right? For drones and for missiles and for some of the other things that, and sanctions busting, some of the other things that the regime in Iran is providing to Russia. So that's their assumption. Again, I remain skeptical. I think there's lots of reasons why that won't happen, but I think that's the idea, is the ceasefire will help facilitate a greater alignment between Moscow and Washington against Khamenei.
There are so many unknowns, Mark. It looks like sometime in 2025 we are going to see a military offense against Iran's nuclear capabilities, and whether that be just Israel alone or some sort of support from the U.S., it remains to be seen, right? But there will be some action in 2025 with that regards.
Well, I think 2025 is going to be an interesting year. I mean, listen, it could go the other way. It could be, a nuclear deal. It could be a nuclear deal that actually ends up being a bad deal for the United States, for Israel, and for the region. There's a risk that President Trump does a bad deal, calls it the greatest deal ever negotiated, submits it to the Senate for ratification. All Republicans support it. Half the Democratic caucus says, bad deal, rather have the deal than war. Now we've got a nuclear treaty. Now the regime gets hundreds of billions of dollars. They preserve their nuclear infrastructure. They wait out Trump. Then they get a Republican or Democrat in the White House in 2029 who's not interested in confronting the Islamic Republic. And now the regime stays in power. They've got more money to fund their terror proxies. They remain brutally repressive internally. And it's just lose, lose, lose across the board. So, you've got to have our eyes on that as well. There may be a diplomatic path that leads to an even worse result than any kind of military confrontation. I would say, again, I think the best policy option in the long term is what we began the conversation with. Right? There's apart from Israel, there's no more pro-American country in the Middle East than Iran, right? There are no more industrious, successful, resilient people than Iranians. I mean, the only place where Iranians don't succeed is inside the Islamic Republic of Iran, because wherever else they go, whether it's Vancouver or Toronto or Los Angeles or New York or Europe, they're unbelievably successful, great immigrants, wonderful culture, wonderful people. And you've got unbelievable potential with 80 million Iranians inside Iran, that if you got rid of the Islamic Republic of Iran, this would be an incredibly prosperous and an incredibly successful country. I think that's what we all dream for. I think on this Nowruz, we must think that hopefully the next one is in a free Iran. But I remain hopeful that what happened to the Soviet Union is going to happen to the Islamic Republic of Iran. One day some teacher's going to walk in and tell all her kids to take their smartphones and throw them in the garbage can because the smartphones had news that turned out to be completely wrong about the viability and longevity of Khamenei's brutal regime.
And when it comes to Trump's zeal for the deal, some experts are saying that the threat of war against Iran is in and of itself related to the way that Trump tries to come up with deals by putting on pressure, and that's part of his diplomacy, if you will. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, listen, you got to cast the shadow of power across the negotiating table. You got to engage in coercive diplomacy. There's no kind of confidence building measures with Khamenei and the IRGC and the regime, right? You've got to demonstrate to the supreme leader that he has a choice between his nuclear weapons program or the survival of his regime. Now, I mean, I have to say, I approach this question of diplomacy with the regime with a lot of trepidation, right? Because even if we get a nuclear deal that fully dismantles the program, and I'm skeptical we will, what does that mean? It means the preservation of the Islamic Republic, at least in the short term, maybe in the medium term. I mean, they're going to get hundreds of billions of dollars. They're not going to spend that money on education. They're not going to spend that money on water. They're not going to spend that money on making the lives of Iranians better. They're going to spend that money on how they always spend that money, right? On terror and on mayhem and on repression and on brutality and on corruption. So I'm worried that a nuclear deal ends up preserving the Islamic Republic of Iran, even if it puts severe restrictions on Iran's nuclear weapons program, which is obviously a good thing, because the worst thing that could happen is this Islamic Republic ends up with nuclear weapons. But Trump needs to arm his diplomacy. It needs to be coercive. The threat of military force needs to be serious and credible, and the use of all instruments of American national power has to be deployed if Trump has any chance of getting a deal that dismantles this nuclear weapons program.
Yeah, there's a lot at stake here. So just to conclude, how would you rate the effectiveness of the Trump administration's policies on Iran so far?
Look, early days. I mean, it's only been 2 months. It feels like it's been 20 years,
yeah,
but
it really
believe
does.
it or not, only 2 months. Yeah, it's quite remarkable. I think so far so good. Yeah, I think they've done what I would expect. They've come right out. The president's been very clear. His national security team have been very clear. They've talked about the dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program. They've talked about the use of economic pressure. The national presidential memorandum, national security memorandum that came out. It was the second memorandum that was issued by the Trump administration. The first was to establish the National Security Council. The second was to impose maximum pressure on the Islamic Republic. And now, even today, Treasury, another round of sanctions designation going after regime oil shipments to China and going after the refineries and the ships that are involved in that. So they're clearly starting to enforce the sanctions that were not seriously enforced under President Biden. And they're currently going after Houthi targets. There's massive U.S. Air Force bombings of the Houthis. They're providing, unflinching support to Israel as Israel confronts the regime's terror proxies in Gaza and in Lebanon, and high-level meetings with the Israelis. Everything is right on, except, as I said time and time again, this missing component of the strategy, maximum support for the people, that needs to be incorporated as an element of maximum pressure.
Anything you'd like to add, Mark, that we haven't touched on?
I would just like to wish all your listeners a wonderful Nowruz. I had the joy of being last week with the community in New York at a remarkable Nowruz celebration. And I wish everybody much peace and prosperity and health and a meaningful Nowruz. And I say next year in Tehran.
Thank you so much, Mark, and happy Nowruz to you and to your family as well. Thank you for joining us today on Eye for Iran.
Nowruz
Piruz.
Bye-bye.
If you like this episode, hit the like button, leave us a comment, and let us know what you think. The Eye for Iran podcast series is brought to you by Iran International, the go-to destination for expert Iranian news in both Farsi and English. For more, head to our dedicated English website, iranintl.com/en.